Well, welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at contingency tables. What is a contingency table, you might ask? Well, great question. Basically, all a contingency table is it's when we have tables of information that breaks down information for us into smaller pieces so we can use that information to be able to make statements and to make assumptions about the data. So in this first example today, we're going to be looking at some information from the Titanic. And because there's a popular conception about the Titanic and that that the rich survived, the middle class and the poor, the lower class, all drowned. And so we're going to be looking at just how accurate that conception is. So let's take a minute now to look at the table and be able to draw out some information from that. So let's look at that now and look at these other examples. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do with this table is we want to come up with some totals here because just having this information is great, but they're going to be asking us some questions like this first one where it says, out of all the people on the Titanic, what percent survived? So in order to figure that out, we're going to have to know some totals here. So let's tabulate each column and each row. And when you do that, you get these numbers. So the first question again is asking us, out of all people on the Titanic, what percent survived? Well, we can see that there's a total of 2,201 people on the Titanic. And out of all those that survived, there were 711 between the first class, second class, third class, and the crew members. There were 711 that survived. So that would be 711 out of the 2,201. Now it's asking us for a percent. So we would divide this out to get a decimal, which would be about 0.323 if you do that on your calculator, which if we round that to a percent, we'll just round it to the nearest tenth of a percent to say 32.3% of all the people on the Titanic survived. Now we can take that information that we have in that table and break it up even more. So here it says, find the percent of passengers in first class who survived. So here we're just looking at just the passengers in first class. So there were 325 first class passengers. Out of those 325 passengers, what percent survived? So it would be 203 out of 325, which gets us approximately, again, if you do that as a rounded to the nearest tenth of a percent, we find that 62.5% of the first class passengers survived. So just those in first class, 62.5% of those passengers in first class survived. Now we could reword it a little bit and say, find the percent of passengers who survived that were in first class. Now this is looking at it a little bit differently. This is saying, out of all of them that survived, there were 711. If we look up here at our table, at our total, there's 711 survivors. Out of those that survived, what percent of them were first class? Well, again, that'd be 203 that survived. Out of all of the survivors would be 711. And again, doing this as a percent, we'd have to first change it to a decimal and then convert that to a percent. Rounding it to the nearest tenth of a percent, we get 28.6%. So that is a percentage of those that survived. So just out of the survivors, those that were first class survivors were 28.6%. Now it's looking at what percent, or out of all the people on the ship, what percent died. So again, this is looking out of all of the people on the ship. So there's 2,201 people on the ship. And what percent died? So we need to know how many died that were on the ship. Well, that's 1,490. And again, changing that to a percent, we get about 68%. So about 68% of those on the ship ended up dying. Now we have to go back and forth once we get to these bottom questions. It says, what percent of passengers in third class died? Again, we're looking at just the passengers in third class. So if we look back up at our column totals, in third class we have 706 passengers. And we want to know what percent of those in third class died. Well, that's 528 that died out of the 706 in third class. And when you change that to a percent, we get 75% of third-class passengers ended up dying. Or you could say the flip side of that, 25% in third class survived versus those that were in first class that survived. There were 28.6%, I'm sorry, 63% in first class that survived. So what percent of passengers in first or second class died? Well, again, we have to look at some totals here, because we have to look at, because this is saying the passengers in first or second class. So for this one, we're going to have to do a little bit of extra work, because we want to figure out what percent of passengers in first or second class died. So we're going to have to look at this information. So we're going to have to find the total number of passengers that died in first and second class. So 122 plus 167, that would give us 289. And for our denominator of fraction, we're going to be looking at the total number of passengers between first and second class. So 325 plus 285 would give us 610. So to figure out what percent of passengers in first or second class died, again, we find those totals, the 289 and the 610. As a percent, that is 47%. So that is how we can use a table to draw out some information. I want you guys now to answer these questions dealing with this table. So first, if you don't have my notes, you're going to have to copy down this information. So you want to copy down this table and find these different totals to start out with, because you're going to use that information to answer each of these questions. And what you want to do is you want to maybe write down what these questions are and pause the video. So here's parts A, B, C, and D. And here's parts E, F, G, and H. So make sure that you pause the video and write down those different parts. And then why don't you go ahead and then after pausing the video and working on all those parts now for A through H, you can hit play to check to see if you got the correct answers. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, so let's check to see how you did. So first off, you should have filled out these totals. So you would have gotten that there's 626 total people that were surveyed here. And you should have gotten all those other totals as well. So what does the total of the third column represent? Well, that 513 represents the patients without a tattoo. They just want to make sure that you understand how to read the table. There's a typo there. Technically, C should have been, what does the total of the second row represent? That would represent the number of patients that has hepatitis C or has HCV. According to this data now, is someone with a tattoo done in a commercial parlor more or less likely to have HCV than someone with a tattoo done elsewhere? So for that, we're going to look at the percent of people that were surveyed that had HCV that got their tattoo done in a commercial parlor, a commercial tattoo parlor, versus those that got a tattoo done elsewhere. So to do that, we first figure out the commercial parlor. The commercial parlor, there's 17 surveyed people that had hepatitis C out of 52 that got theirs done in a commercial parlor. So that's about 33%. So about 33% of people that got it done in a parlor had HCV. Where people that had it done elsewhere, I don't know where elsewhere would be, 8 of those surveyed out of 61 that got it elsewhere had HCV, which would be about 13%. So you're about 20% more likely to get HCV or hepatitis C having your tattoo done in a commercial parlor as opposed to being done somewhere else. Now it says, what percent of people in the study did not have a tattoo? Well, there were 513 people that did not have a tattoo out of a total of 626, which means that you'd have about 82% of people that in the survey that did not have a tattoo. What percent of people in the study with no tattoo had HCV? Well, that was 4% because there were 18 people that didn't have tattoo out of 500, or that had hepatitis C or HCV without a tattoo. And there's 513 people, again, that surveyed that didn't have a tattoo. So 18 out of the 513, or 4%, had HCV. Now in part G it says what percent of people in the study with a tattoo had HCV. Now this one's a little bit trickier because what you had to do is we first had to figure out how many people with a tattoo had hepatitis C. Well, there's 17 people that had it done in a parlor and 8 people that had it done elsewhere that had a HCV, or 25 people total. And there were 52 and 61 people that had tattoos, so a total of 113 people that had tattoos. So out of those 113, 25 people had HCV, or 22%. So what can you conclude about parts F and G? Well, one thing you could have written is that if you have a tattoo, you're more likely to have HCV by about 18%. Well, let's conclude by looking at this last example. In this example, it says 5th grade students in a school were surveyed about their favorite book series. The results are reported in the contingency table below. Now you might recognize that this contingency table looks different from the other ones. This one, it has all the values in each of the rows and columns as percents rather than giving us the actual data amounts, which limits what we can do here. But let's answer this first question. It says, what does the 23% in the first row, third column represent? So then we want to make sure that we know how to be able to read this table. So in the first row, first column, we see the 23% here. That's referring to the fact that 23% of the 5th grade boys like Lemony Snicket as their favorite. Easy enough. Now let's look at part B. It says, which is larger, the number of boys who prefer Animorphs or the number of girls who prefer Lemony Snicket? Now you got to be careful because you might think that it's 15% of the boys that like Animorphs and 51% of the girls, 28% of the girls like Lemony Snicket. However, the fact that they're giving us percentages rather than actual amounts limits what we can do because we don't know the actual amount of boys that liked Animorphs and we don't know the actual amount of girls that like Lemony Snicket. Even though 15% of the boys preferred Animorphs or said that Animorphs were their favorite series, that doesn't mean that there's less boys than girls that chose that one. And we don't know any of the totals, so we can't figure it out on our own. So we're really limited by what we can say here. So in other words, our answer here is that there's not enough information that they've given us. Well, let's end by looking at letter C here. Suppose the 5th grade class contains 117 girls and 125 boys. Did more boys than girls prefer Lemony Snicket? Well, now we have an actual number to work with. So now we can actually figure out how many girls and how many boys liked Lemony Snicket. So let's start with the girls here. So we know that 28% of the girls like Lemony Snicket, so that's going to be 0.28 times 117. Well, that gives you 32.76, or approximately 30, because obviously we don't have 3/4 of a student. So that's approximately 33 students, or 33 girls, I should say, that preferred Lemony Snicket. And for the boys, 23% of the boys answered or said that they like that, and so there's 125 boys in the class, so 23% of 125 gives us a total of 28.75. Or again, we can round that to 29, and we can round this to 33. So we can see that there's more girls than boys that preferred Lemony Snicket. So we would say just that there's more girls would be our answer. So there we have it. That ends this lesson. So with that, hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to be able to read a contingency table. So good luck now as you work on some of these on your own.